It was a civil rights movement. Denmark Vesey's insurrection was 1822. It was a civil rights movement. The Niagara movement that led to the creation of the NAACP more than 100 years ago was a civil rights movement. John Lewis and I met in October 1960 at a civil rights movement. For as long as there are people held in suppression, there will always be a movement for civil rights. However, in any movement, there will be a few, sometimes only one, that rises head and shoulders above all others. And so it was with my good friend, John Robert Lewis. When we met the weekend of October 13, 14, 15, 1960 on the campus of Morehouse College, there was a little bit of an insurrection taking place. We who were college students felt that we knew how best to do things. We were not listening to Martin Luther King Jr. and a few others. And so we asked King to meet with us, and he did. We went into the meeting around 10 o'clock in the evening. We did not walk out of that room until 4 o'clock the next morning. I came out of that room having had a Saul to Paul transformation. I have never been the same since. But listen to King's plea for nonviolence. I decided, along with most others, to accept nonviolence as a tactic. But not John Lewis. He internalized it. It became his way of life. And after going through a few issues of the 60s, you know, John got elected president of SNCC in 1963 and was 1966. But John then joined the effort, the Voter Education Project, where he directed, that was sponsored by the Southern Regional Council. And as he served as director of the Voter Education Project, headquartered in Atlanta, I became the chair of the Voter Education Project in Charleston, South Carolina, and we continued that relationship. He got married to a librarian. I got married to a librarian, though I did so before he did. And they became fast friends. Lillian and Emily became fast friends. I will never, ever get John Robert Lewis out of my system because he succeeded where I failed. It was a tactic for me. It was a way of life for John Lewis, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of the special order. I now yield to, thank you. I now yield to Representative Eleanor Norton Holmes from the District of Columbia, the state of the District of Columbia.
I want to thank the gentlewoman from California, Karen Bass, for leading this special order to our good colleague and friend, John Lewis. John and I were elected to the House of Representatives about the same time. Actually, he was elected a couple of years before I was. But we were colleagues before either of us could have hoped to become members of Congress. We were kids together in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the youth arm of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. The difference between John and me is I was in law school, so I went in the summer, and John was a full-time member who left school in order to join SNCC. And SNCC came out of lunch counters. Ella Baker called us all together because it was clear that the civil rights movement was developing a youth arm. And Ella Baker, the great elder of the civil rights movement, decided all of us we really should become an organization. John was not the first head of SNCC. Marion Barry was, because he was a lot more political than John. And he's remembered today more for his politics than for his civil rights acumen. When John was elected chair of SNCC, there was nothing political about it. His qualification was not that he was the strongest or the most articulate or whatever you want to call it. His strongest qualification was that he was the bravest, pure and simple. It is almost impossible to describe the risks John took in the more than 40 times he was arrested, because today we're so used to civil disobedience. People right now are lying down on Pennsylvania Avenue after the George Floyd killing. So we're used to that. So I really want to call to your attention what it meant when John led young people to be arrested. Everybody has seen the film of his being knocked down as he marched in the front of the line. He had a concussion as a result of that. He never knew, as he led these marches, whether he would come out alive. Let me tell you about these marches when SNCC would kneel down and assume other nonviolent postures. On the other side, we're not counter demonstrators. On the other side were not other people who were confronting us nonviolently. On the other side were the police leading white mobs. I must tell you, they were befuddled, though, by the tactics of SNCC and the civil rights movement. Because when you kneel down and nonviolent, they didn't quite know what to do with you or about you. John, of course, will always be remembered as a member of the House of Representatives. But as I close, I must say it will be difficult even for John to have done more in the House than he did in the civil rights movement, to do more in Congress than he did for his country. I thank the gentlewoman for yielding.
His legacy to our country is that he devoted his life to fighting for justice, and being a moral compass to our nation. I'd like to yield to Representative Bobby Scott from the great state of Virginia.
Thank you, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today for a solemn occasion. Tonight we honor our friend, brother, colleague, the conscience of the Congress, a true American icon, Congressman John Lewis. Words cannot convey the loss to this body as well as to the nation, but very few can claim to have altered the course of American history the way that John did. He was a guiding light to all of us and was a leader trying to make America a more perfect union. His steadfast moral leadership will be deeply missed, particularly at this complex time in our history. Those of us here today are standing on his shoulders. His historic life and legacy will undoubtedly live on, but we must be sure to continue his life's work, particularly when it comes to voting rights and restoring the Voting Rights Act. we must make some good trouble to honor his enormous legacy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Congressman John Lewis spent his life fighting racism and injustice wherever he confronted it, from boycotts, sit-ins, and other protests in the streets to championing bold, progressive policies in Congress, including the Voting Rights Act. I now yield 1 minute to the Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. Yes. We need to tell them who's next. Yeah. Oh. Let me come back to you, Representative Lee. I'd like to yield 1 minute to Representative Danny Davis from the state of Illinois. So, 1 minute. Everyone has 1 minute.
I want to thank the gentlelady. You know, to every man there is a way, a ways, and a way. The high souls take the highway, and the low souls take the low, while all the rest on the misty flats drift to and fro. But to every man there is a way, a ways, and a way. And each man decideth which way his soul shall go. John Lewis always took the high road, always giving of himself in such a way that you knew that he was gracious and kind. John had faith. Like John, I grew up in rural America, went to a one-room school, never had a new school book, but John had the faith of a mustard seed and said, if you want to move a mountain, just say to the mountain, be moved. And if it wouldn't, then you get you some dynamite, nitroglycerin, TNT, and blow that sucker down. That was John Lewis. May he rest in peace.
Now that he's no longer with us, we have to live up to his legacy and protect the right to vote for all Americans. As we continue to face challenges due to the coronavirus and issues of systemic racism, we must protect our democracy and elections, even in the midst of adversity. I now yield to Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. 1 minute. All speakers have 1 minute.
We are all heartbroken. We all are speechless. We all are committed to John Robert Lewis's beloved community. Each of us have been touched without ceasing for the spirit he led us in, acknowledging, even in anger, that there was the beloved community. He loved his wife and his family and his extended brothers and sisters all the way from Alabama to Georgia. And I'm reminded of his ability to love Dr. Martin Luther King. It is the testament of a man that is able to extend love and not to show envy, but to learn and to seek knowledge. John did that, which allowed him to carry that all the way to the fights of today. John Robert Lewis, Dr. King said, "Are you the boy from Troy?" He loved to tell that story. He loved to tell that he preached to the chickens, but his voices were heard by kings and queens. John Robert Lewis, a saint walking on earth. I'm reminded of our days in front of the South African embassy, arrested against genocide or fighting against the children in cages. John never stopped his fight. And so I come today to honor him in this brief moment that we have, to be able to say, isn't it good that a saintly man walked on this earth and reminded us of the beloved community. I am very glad to say that I knew, and the world knows, John Robert Lewis, the boy from Troy. With that, I yield back.
Yes, I now yield 1 minute to Representative Gregory Meeks from New York.
John Robert Lewis was short in height, yet he was a giant. John Robert Lewis was a humbled man, but fierce for justice. John Robert Lewis talked softly, but roared like a lion when it was time to fight for freedom, justice, and equality for all humankind. He said there was one race, the human race. He is an individual that compelled a nation to change to make it better. His voice will echo in this chamber forever. It was my honor and pleasure for 22 years to serve with the Honorable John Robert Lewis. May he rest in peace and rise in power.
I yield 1 minute to Representative David Scott from Georgia.
Thank you very much. John Lewis's mother and his grandmother named him John after John the Apostle, the disciple, the scripture says, whom Jesus loved, John the beloved. And John himself, Lewis, dedicated his life to building the beloved community. And one more thing, John Lewis being named after John, Jesus's apostle, it must be noted that the Apostle John was the youngest of the disciples. John Lewis was the youngest of our civil rights leaders who spoke at the momentous March on Washington. God bless John Lewis, and we thank God for sending him our way.
I yield 1 minute to Al Green, Representative Al Green from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to say thank you to a friend and a great warrior. I thank you, dear brother, for being the sermon you preached. You walked your talk. It is said that a great person will always rise to the occasion, but it's also said that the greater person makes the occasion. He was an occasion maker, and he rose to the occasion on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And for this, many of us who are here tonight are here because he marched into brutality. So tonight, I thank you, dear brother, for being able to withstand what many of us could not and would not. I rise to just say thank you and to let you know that we will never forget you, and we will always make it perspicuously clear that we are here because you were there. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to Representative Yvette Clark from New York.
Thank you, dear sister. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to honor a great man, the Representative John Lewis. This past Friday, July 17th, our country lost one of its greatest heroes, a true patriot who literally put his life on the line in the pursuit of justice and fairness in our society. The Honorable John Lewis was a penultimate hero who embodied the struggle for human rights and dignity. He was a fierce civil rights warrior who refused to abide with the Jim Crow laws of the South. He embodied what it means to be a public servant, putting his life on the line and the people above his own self-interest. I'm so honored and privileged to have served with John Robert Lewis. John Robert Lewis, who was a dancer, a man who loved to have fun, but was convicted for the right to vote, convicted as an activist for civil rights and civil liberties. And I will forever hold dear the moment that we landed in Ghana together, invited by the president of Ghana for the right to return, and to see the wonderment in his eyes of visiting a space where it all began for all of us 401 years ago. May he rest in peace and rise in power. The Honorable John Lewis will never be forgotten. We all hold on to his legacy.
To honor Mr. Lewis, the first thing we need to do is to pass legislation restoring the Voting Rights Act and get it signed. We know the credibility of our elections has already shown early signs of concern during several state primaries, and voter suppression cases, coupled with the fact that people are going to have to vote in dangerous conditions, cannot be ignored. I know that if Mr. Lewis were still with us, he would be leading that fight. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to Representative Hank Johnson from Georgia.
I thank the Speaker and I thank the gentlelady from California. Mr. Speaker, much has been said about my friend, teacher, and mentor, John Lewis. He was a family man, married to Lillian for 44 years, and to that union bore a son, John Miles, who is with us today, along with John Lewis's brothers and sisters. He was number 3 of 10. So he's got a large extended family, and that family entrusted John to the world. And for 33 years, he was our colleague. For 14 years, he was mine. I just want to say to the family that we here in Congress feel your pain. We appreciate your sacrifice in allowing John to do what he did for the world and for Congress. I want you to know that we stand with you. We feel your pain, and we will never forget your dear brother, uncle, cousin, whoever he was to you. We will never forget him. We know that he loved you. He would depart this place to go to the family reunion during the summer down in Alabama, where the family still owned hundreds of acres of land that they farmed even when his 2 sharecropping parents gave birth to John. And so he was a family man. Thank you, family, for entrusting him to us. And with that, I yield back.
Being managed by Congressman Sanford Bishop of Georgia. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're here today to honor Congressman John Robert Lewis, our hero, our colleague, our brother, our friend. Having known John for 52 years, I can tell you honestly that even in his humanity, he lived his life in the image of Jesus. John was a voice for the voiceless, for African Americans, for women, for LGBTQ people, for the least and the left out, for anyone mistreated by society. His unwavering sense of right and wrong was a North Star for this nation, which is why we called him the conscience of the Congress. People as good as John don't come our way very often. Despite all the accolades and recognition he received, John remained humble, unfailingly kind, and always sure of the capacity of people to be better despite their past transgressions. Where would America be today if it were not for John Lewis? Without his activism, without his courage, without his perseverance for voting rights, I doubt if I'd be here today. Thank you, John, for your lifetime of advocacy, for sacrifice, for friendship and counsel. And thank you, God, for the life of John Robert Lewis. At this time, I am delighted to yield to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Andre Carson.
Thank you.
Is recognized for one minute.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. John Lewis was certainly a leader amongst men. He was a mentor, he was a friend. My heart goes out to his family. Our hearts go out to his family. I can remember, Mr. Speaker, during the health care vote, it was coming out of Cannon. I ran into John, and he asked, how many votes do we have left? Or how much time do we have left? I said, I think we'll make it. We crossed the street along with his chief, Michael, and there were thousands of people yelling, kill the bill, kill the bill, kill the bill. And that wasn't it. They were yelling expletives, racial expletives at the three of us. And John looked at me and said, Brother Andre, this reminds me of a darker time, brother. John became a mentor. We'd call him up and he'd speak to the Muslim community. We'd call him up and he'd speak to the folks in Indiana who were there when it was announced that Dr. King had passed, because he was in Indianapolis at the time. He was a true servant, Mr. Speaker. Jesus was mentioned. John was like Jesus. I'm reminded of a scripture when Jesus was having a conversation with his disciples about this notion of leadership. And Jesus looked at his disciples and said, he who wishes to be chief amongst you shall first be your servant. John was a servant. He wasn't the kind of leader that looked at the protesters today and said, what you're going through is nothing compared to what we went through. He stood in solidarity with those young folks and embraced those young folks like a real leader. And John is an example to all of us what true public servants should be. We love you, John. God bless.
Right. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
We make our living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. John Lewis certainly made a life. I'm pleased to yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Maxine Waters. Well, I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Terry Sewell.
Gentlelady from Selma, Alabama, Ms. Terry Sewell is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life and outstanding legacy of our colleague, friend, mentor, and my hero, Congressman John Robert Lewis. Growing up as a little girl in Selma, Alabama, John's incredible legacy was a hero's tale as familiar to me as any Bible story or family lore. As a little girl singing in the choir, the children's choir at Brown Chapel AME Church, my home church, the church where John and so many wonderful foot soldiers would come time and time again to honor the legacy of the Bloody Sunday March. But to know John was to know a man without ego, who despite his well-deserved accolades and successes, loved every person he met. He looked them in the eye. Can't you hear him? My brother, my sister, he would say. John loved this country more than any person that I met, and it was his deep-seated patriotism that will live on. His legacy indeed was the Voting Rights Act, and we in this body can do something about that. Yes, we can name things for John, but the biggest thing that we can do is rename H.R. 4. Never give in. Keep your eyes on the prize. Keep the faith.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bishop.
George Washington Carver once said, "How far you go in life depends on your being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, and tolerant of the weak and strong, because someday in your life you will have been all of these." That was our friend John Lewis. I'm delighted to yield to the gentlelady from Ohio, Joyce Beatty.
Gentlelady
For
from
1 minute.
Ohio, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. America has lost a national treasure, one of the world's greatest fighters and defenders of freedom and justice. Congressman Lewis's words and work and legacy will live forever. I am so fortunate to have traveled to Africa with him and to marched in my hometown with him. You see, Mr. Speaker, when Mr. Lewis spoke, you heard the voice of history, a voice that helped stir the conscience of America. And at a time of ugliness and struggle, but also at a time and an era of hope and accomplishment. So, my colleagues, there is no greater time for us to stand up against injustices that we are facing. No greater time for us to fight for justice and fairness at the ballot box. So, my colleagues, let us make some noise. Let us get in trouble, good trouble. God bless you. Rest in peace. Rest in power, my friend. Good trouble.
Chair recognizes Mr. Bishop.
I am pleased to yield to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Robin Kelly.
Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly,
Illinois.
is recognized. Gentlelady from
Stand corrected.
Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to share my letter to Congressman John Robert Lewis. Dear John, I hope you knew how incredibly honored I was to call you colleague and to serve with you. It was such a great privilege to watch you in action and listen to your stories. When we planned the sit-in, being a part of the Fab Five made me so proud. It took a while to get the bill out of the House, but we finally did it. I promise you, when I encounter a situation that is just not right, I will stand up, speak out, and get in the way. I plan to carry a piece of you with me forever. I know I will be a better person for it. I hope you, C.T. Vivian, Martin, Rosa, Edgar, and Robert Kennedy, and others are having a fabulous reunion. Rest in power, my friend. Until we meet again, love, Robin.
Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Speaker, how much time remains?
23. You're advised that you have 22 minutes remaining.
Thank you. At this time, I'm delighted to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Brenda Lawrence.
Congresswoman Lawrence is recognized.
Thank you. Just this year, I remember John urging Americans to get into good trouble, necessary trouble, and to help redeem the soul of America as we combat some of the most hateful messages and priorities driven by this current administration. Today, I stand here, John. I promise that I will continue to carry out your legacy, to get into good trouble and to ensure that the fight for equality and justice lives on, and challenge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same and pass the Voting Rights Act. John, rest in peace, rest in power. You have been a good and faithful servant, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bishop.
At this time, I'm delighted to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Representative Dwight Evans.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dwight Evans, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to honor truly a great American and a real-life hero. I was fortunate enough to have him as a colleague for 4 years. Congressman John Lewis has been an inspiration to me at a very young age. I remember the first time I saw him was on the evening news. He was walking across the Pettit Bridge. I felt very strongly about him and what he was doing. I was 10 years old, and I found him to be inspiring. He was purposeful. He was driven to make a difference. He was driven to make some good trouble. Now, we must carry on with the work of civil rights and equal opportunity. Rest in power, Congressman Lewis.
Mr. Bishop.
At this time, I'm delighted to yield to the gentlelady from Florida, Representative Val Demings.
Gentlelady from Florida, Congresswoman Val Demings is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on June 12th of 2016, a lone gunman walked into the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle. That night, the shooter killed 49 people and injured 53 others. At the time, it was the largest mass shooting in American history. The Pulse nightclub is in my district, but I was not in Congress at the time. But when I saw the members of Congress taken to the floor and holding a sit-in, I was not surprised that the person leading the way was Representative John Lewis. To him, the victims were a part of the big family John Lewis often spoke about. Thank you, John, for never discriminating. Thank you, John, for never leaving people behind. Galatians 5 defines the fruit of the Spirit as love, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. John Lewis was all of that to the House, to the nation, and to the world. And I am grateful for his friendship and his counsel, and grateful for a life well lived. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bishop.
At this time, I'm delighted to yield to the gentlelady from Georgia, Representative Lucy McBath.
The gentlelady from the state of Georgia, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, is recognized.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Tonight, we stand in this great chamber and mourn our friend, a civil rights icon, and the conscience of Congress. John Lewis towered over his era, and his loss is deeply felt across this country and across the globe. From marching for freedom in Montgomery to being beaten and bloodied on a bridge in Selma, John's life showed us all the fundamental need for good, necessary trouble. As John would often say, we have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate to do what we can to make our country and our world a better place, and to help usher in a loving community where no one is left out or left behind. His words and his life ring through eternity. We will honor John's legacy with an unshakable determination to fight for what is right and what is just. He served the nation in love. Rest in peace, my friend. We love you. I love you. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back.
May I request the amount of time remaining?
The gentleman has 15 minutes remaining.
At this time, I'm delighted to yield to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Kwaisi Mfume.
The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Kwaisi Mfume, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've been hearing and will continue to hear, the passing of John Lewis represents a loss for America of one of her greatest heroes. And for many of us, a dear and old friend. John and I were sworn in together in this chamber 33 years ago as classmates in the 100th Congress. There were only 4 African Americans elected to Congress that year. He, myself, Floyd Flake of New York, and Mike Espy of Mississippi. And we huddled with John here on the floor, and he made all of us hug each other, and he said, "We got here in different ways, but we are one band of brothers now." The passion and the equality that he carried with him throughout his life, as we know, never waned. And his untiring quest for justice never faltered. With a big heart for compassion, John, like his mentor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was unawed by opinion, unseduced by flattery, and undismayed by disaster. Birthed in an era of Jim Crow and vile and vicious segregation, he defied the limitedness of others' expectations. John knew that politics changed people, so he set out early to change politics. Everything about him pointed to the fact that he was emblematic of that great band of freedom fighters who realized that freedom wasn't free. And so in this era where everyone seems to be searching for the next big thing or the next great thing, isn't it odd, Mr. Speaker, that the greatness of John Lewis was with us all along? We needed only to look as far as the latest movement for social change to find it. We are sad today, but heaven is rejoicing, and John has claimed his final reward. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields back.
It has been said that service is the rent we pay for the space we occupy on this earth. John Lewis paid his rent, and he paid it well. At this time, I'm delighted to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Representative Will Hurd.
The gentleman from the 23rd District of Texas, Congressman Will Hurd, is recognized.
A freedom rider, unshaken by threats and violence. A leader in the struggle for voting rights who kept fighting even after a broken skull. A courageous American undeterred by more than 40 arrests after standing up for what's right. John Lewis spent his life fighting injustice and racism. If it weren't for the bravery of John and men and women like him, many of us wouldn't be in this chamber today. And as a Black man, I'm not sure I would have had the same rights as my fellow countrymen. John shaped this country in immeasurable ways. He never sat by when he saw injustice. He never stopped fighting. And at a time when America is so divided, we should look at John's courage for inspiration. We should look at John's bravery for imitation. And we should look at John's words and follow them. I lost a mentor. John's family lost a father, son, brother, and husband. Our country lost an American hero. Rest in peace, my brother.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Bishop.
I'm delighted to yield at this time to the gentlelady from California, Representative Barbara Lee.
The gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What a void we feel tonight. I rise to honor the life and legacy of a great warrior for peace and justice, a kind and gentle human being, the conscience of the Congress, Congressman John Lewis. Now, as a giant of, and as our whip indicated, a civil rights movement, John's leadership and his courage continued as an extraordinary congressional leader. Every year I joined John on his annual pilgrimage to Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, Alabama. I brought young people from the Martin Luther King Freedom Center in my district and my grandchildren each year to learn about and give thanks to the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement. John always took time to meet with these young people, even this year with his failing health. He pulled them aside, he met with them. He always wanted, and he did, inspire them to take that baton and to run the next lap of the race for justice and equality. And yes, like with so many, he blessed my community by coming to my district to continue these efforts with my young people. Last year, Speaker Pelosi and Chairwoman Bass led a delegation to Ghana, West Africa, to observe the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans brought to America. John said, he said that Ghana was one of the most moving trips of his life. And he said, and I quote, "To see and behold the inhumanity during another period of our history," he said, "it tells each and every one of us never to let this evil happen again." Now, John was welcomed in Ghana as royalty, which he was, and he was honored as a son of Africa who had come home. John and I would compare notes on tough votes, such as on matters of war and peace and defense spending. I will miss his wise counsel and admonition, and really admonition, to do the right thing, as he told all of us to keep our eyes on the prize. Now, members know how we get agitated when our colleagues poach our staff members. Well, John poached a brilliant and wonderful young woman from my office, Jamila Thompson. And when he told me about it, believe it or not, for the first time, I was thrilled. I was thrilled that one of my staff members had been poached by John Lewis. What an honor. John's presence in the People's House will be deeply missed, but one of the greatest tributes to Congressman John Lewis would be to restore the Voting Rights Act. I would not be standing here as the 100th Black member of Congress had it not been for the Honorable John Robert Lewis. My deepest condolences and love and gratitude to John's family, Michael Collins, Jamila Thompson, his entire phenomenal staff, and his constituents, and to all those whose lives he touched. Let us continue to build the beloved community that he so eloquently spoke of. In closing, I am reminded of a scripture, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, excuse me. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." As John Lewis's soul returns to his creator, may he rest in peace, may he rest in power.
Gentlelady yields back.
How much time is remaining?
7. Gentleman has 7 minutes remaining.
As we come to the close of this first hour of tribute to our friend and our colleague and our hero, John Robert Lewis, I leave you with the words of Douglas Mallock, who wrote, "A tree that never had to fight for sun and sky and air and light, that stood out in the open plain and always got its share of rain, never became a forest king, but lived and died a scrubby thing. A man who never had to toil by hand or mind in life's turmoil, who never had to earn his share of sun and sky and light and air, never became a manly man, but lived and died as he began. Good timber doesn't grow in ease. The stronger wind, the stronger trees. The farther sky, the greater length. The rougher storms, the greater strength. By wind or rain, by sun or snow, in trees or man, good timbers grow." John Robert Lewis was indeed good timber. God bless his soul. May he rest in peace and in power.
The gentleman yields back his time. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2019, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, is now recognized for 60 minutes as a designee of the minority leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's my honor this evening to oversee the time, to manage the time that we have on the Republican side to celebrate and remember the life of our tremendous colleague, Mr. John Lewis. Mr. Speaker, I was very moved having the opportunity to watch my colleagues on the other side of the aisle discuss and describe the impact that Congressman Lewis had on their lives, on all of our lives, and on this chamber. And I'm struck by the fact that as we gather tonight in this chamber, we rise not as representatives of two different political parties, but we rise as representatives, elected representatives of this great nation, and a nation that's mourning the loss of a great American and an honored colleague. As a man, John Lewis, who dedicated his life to service and to the fight for justice and freedom. John Lewis taught us, quote, "Nothing can stop the power of a committed and determined people to make a difference in our society." Why? Because human beings are the most dynamic link to the divine on this planet. John Lewis understood that one man or woman can make a difference. Indeed, that it is only the determined and principled action of committed men and women that brings change. He knew the blessings of this nation, and he knew what it took to secure those blessings for all Americans. He knew that the fight was unfinished. Mr. Speaker, the day that I was sworn into this body for the first time, I was standing just outside these doors in the Speaker's lobby. I had just arrived with my dad, who joined me on the floor that day. By chance, as we were coming in, we met John Lewis standing in the lobby. And the three of us had the chance before the ceremony to spend some time together. The two of them didn't agree on much, but they did agree on certain critical things. They agreed on the exceptional nature of this country, on the magnificence of this, the people's house, and on the incalculable blessings of freedom. And I am blessed by the memory of that day. And I am blessed that at that moment when I was about to be sworn into this house, I was able to spend time with those two men. Writing of his experiences fighting for civil rights, John Lewis said this, quote, "Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair and more just society." Great men and women like John Lewis in every generation have known this, that we all have an obligation to defend our freedom, to fight for it, to do our part, to be worthy of the sacrifices of those who have gone before. One of the greatest gifts we can give to young people today is to teach them that lesson, to teach them our history, convey to them the duty, the obligation, and the incredible blessing of being an American, and of working to make sure that we pass this nation to our children and our grandchildren more perfect than it is today. Our colleague, Congressman John Lewis, dedicated his life to that ideal. His memory will be a blessing and an example to us all, our colleagues, his colleagues here in the House, to his family, to his constituents, and to his fellow Americans. God bless John Lewis, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I will yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Mark Walker, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're honored to participate in this special order, and we will look forward to hearing from our speakers in honoring the great John Lewis. And tonight we would like to begin with Mr. Steny Hoyer. Is he yield time to him? All right, we will skip over that right quick, and then okay, well then we'll start with some opening comments, and then we'll wait when he shows up there.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over this past weekend, America not only lost a civil rights icon, but also a loving father, a loving husband, a caring friend to this entire House body, Congressman John Lewis. Mr. Lewis's courage and strength in the face of oppression is unmatched. His contributions to America's soul is paramount to the progress that we have made in our histories. His experience on Bloody Sunday left him battered, covered in blood, and on the side of the road in Selma, Alabama. Yet he carried on with his unifying message for America. Many years ago, John Lewis crossed the monumental Edmund Pettus Bridge fighting for freedom and a path towards achieving what our founding fathers had pledged but fell short to uphold. I was extremely honored to have the opportunity 54 years later to walk across this very bridge in Selma, and we all honored the brave steps he led, rallying an entire nation. The fact that I was asked to give the closing remarks at Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church in Montgomery is something, frankly, that I'll always treasure. John Lewis' protest inspired our nation to not only do better, but to reflect on all of our actions. Through his grace and humility, he made monumental progress. He liked to refer to these acts as good trouble. While we don't share many of the same political opinions, there was never a doubt in my mind that Congressman John Lewis lived his entire life fighting for our country and the American people. He gave us all hope that we could get over this partisan divide, hope that we could get over the divisions of the past to paint a brighter future. May we never lose his spirit and forever honor his legacy by never letting the forces of division, hatred, and evil tear down those bridges that so many of us have sacrificed to divide. And with that, I yield to our whip, Congressman Steve Scalise.
The gentleman from Louisiana, the Republican whip, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend and colleague from North Carolina for yielding, and join with my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, who mourn the loss of John Lewis. You know, we have so many honors to be able to serve in a job like this, where we get to represent the peopleless nation, especially here in the People's House, where you truly do bring in all of the different elements of what makes America great into one body, with people who represent every different type of background and every different kind of community, the kinds of people that we get to serve with. And there are giants among the people that we have the honor of serving with. John Lewis was at the top of that list. And you knew it when you served with him. I remember telling colleagues years ago that while we have our differences, it's really important to go get to know, especially some of the legends, the giants that we serve with in this body. I remember talking about two members in particular. It was John Lewis and Sam Johnson. One Democrat, one Republican, two people who were just giants. Unfortunately, we've now lost both of them in the last year. Our institution is better because John Lewis was a part of this great body. But it's what John fought for his whole life. When I know my colleague from North Carolina, as well as my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, talked about earlier his mantra of good trouble. What John experienced in his life, there are so many people who have freedoms today they would never have if John hadn't gone through that. I had an honor, like so many of my colleagues, to go with John. He invited members from both parties to go to Selma to be a part of reliving that history, which was the dark side of our history, Bloody Sunday, but one that John used as a teachable moment to bring people from all parts of this country to walk across that Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I got to walk arm in arm with John. It was one of the great honors I've had as a member of Congress to be able to do that. And the whole time you're walking with him, this could be a moment that John wants to just leave in his past because he was so brutally beaten. But he wanted to share the experiences. And as we were walking, we would round the corner and he would point to different buildings. He said, that's where we gathered. That's where some of the people who were trying to stop us would be. He helped organize the Student Nonviolent Committee, SNCC, and SNCC. And he started at a young age in the civil rights movement at a time when it was not only difficult, but it was possibly life-threatening. And for many, they did lose their life in that battle. And John lost blood. He shed blood for the cause, but he never took it as a moment to get down. He never took it as a moment to be bitter. He wanted to continue fighting to make America spirit. He was one of those very few people in a body like this where when he stood at the podium to speak, no matter what side you were on that issue, you stopped, you sat down, and you listened because you knew you were listening to somebody who was larger than life. John's in a better place right now, but America's a better place because John was here. God bless John Lewis and his family. Now I yield back to my friend from North
Gentleman
Carolina.
yields back. Mr. Walker.
Thank you, man. I'd like to recognize Doris Matsui from California.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Doris Matsui, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak in honor of beloved colleague and wonderful friend, John Lewis. I first met John when my late husband, Bob Matsui, was a member of Congress. Bob loved John. He loved him for his humanity, his conviction, and the fact that he was a total human being. I had heard so much about John because he was a historic figure, but I saw another side of him too when Bob brought him to Sacramento. And he met many people, and I remember his walking across a university campus with the president of the university when he ran across, Bob and he and John, a bunch of chickens that the students were advocating for to keep on campus. And the president was saying, no, we got to get the chickens out. And the president says, excuse me, Mr. Lewis, but we're going to get rid of those chickens. And John said, no way you're going to get rid of those chickens. I learned to preach by preaching to chickens. And that is the part of John that I really love too, that humorous part, the part you can laugh with. But this gentle giant lived also every single day to overcome injustice, eradicate racism, and give hope to all who walked beside him. And he's a total person. And at this moment in our history when speaking truth to power is so vital, it is more important than ever to follow John's words, to stand up, speak out, and keep your eyes on the prize. John taught us all that America is greater than the sum of its parts. When you weave a rich, colorful tapestry, the weaving itself makes it strong. His impact will be forever felt on our nation's conscience, and we're all better for it. At this difficult time, my prayers are with the Lewis family and all his friends, and he will be sorely missed. I love you, John. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to
Walker.
recognize, only first makes sense to John Lewis's colleagues, the delegation from Georgia, starting with our Deputy Whip, Congressman Drew Ferguson.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker,
Yes.
and the gentleman from North Carolina, thank you for allowing me to do this. I rise to honor tonight to honor the life and legacy of John Lewis. John had dedicated his life to equality and justice, and the nation we are so blessed to live in is better because of his work and his sacrifice. John was driven by his deep faith, his servant heart, and his love of his fellow human being. And while John was always right to fight for legal changes to make America better, he ultimately knew that how you treated your fellow human being was a matter of the heart. And John led by example. He led by showing love and grace to all people. He showed, even though he showed love and grace even to those people that disagreed with him or showed him contempt. John was always willing to offer forgiveness to those who had done him wrong, knowing that forgiveness was fundamental to building a relationship built on trust and love. Two of my most vivid memories and treasured experiences here in my time in Congress involved John. One was a dinner at his house. He invited the Georgia delegation over, and he retold the story of his life and experiences in the civil rights movement. What a cherished memory and experience. The second was the night that we honored another Georgia giant here, former House member and former U.S. Senator Johnny Isakson. I remember the night that Johnny Isakson and John Lewis met in the center and embraced in true love, friendship, and respect. It's truly an amazing moment. John was an amazing man, and I believe that the only thing John Lewis ever hated was hate itself. Rest in peace, our dear friend.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from New York, Nita Loy.
Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Nita Loy, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to honor the memory of Congressman John Lewis, an American hero, a dear friend. He taught us what patriotism is, that to love our country is to acknowledge and work to repair its imperfections. Congressman Lewis endured angry mobs, death threats, so much violence with endurance, persistence, and even warmth and optimism. Surely we can honor his remarkable life by coming together to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, to ensure our laws reflect that Black lives matter. Advocating for the nation's marginalized throughout his life, acting as the conscience of Congress during his 34 years of service, he inspired generations of Americans to get in good trouble. I remember sitting on the floor with John. Rather than sitting on the chair, we were proving our point and all sitting on the floor. He has taught us so much with his sweet, sweet manner, but the strength of his conviction. We must honor Congressman Lewis's legacy by striving to achieve the equitable and just society for all that he fought so hard to attain, in the words of John himself. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Dear, sweet, kind John, we will miss you. We love you. May you rest in peace.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Representative Austin Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the gentleman from North Carolina for a few minutes to speak about my friend and colleague, Congressman John Lewis, and a man that I loved, and I will miss dearly him saying, I love you too, brother. There's no telling how many times John Lewis told the people of this house, I love you too, brother. And he looked at everybody, no matter who you were, as a brother. And I selfishly thought about how much I was going to miss him, and seeing him and Michael Collins on a Delta ready to fly up here. And I always got a kick out of the fact that people from my district would sit down next to me and say, did you see John Lewis on the plane? And by the way, what do you do? And that was just the way people loved John Lewis. There's not a person walking in this country today that didn't benefit from John Lewis and what he did for mankind. And I would venture to say that the majority of the people in the world benefited from his love and what he did. So I thought about a few passages. We've talked about him preaching to the chickens, and maybe we're the chickens that he was preaching to his whole life. But I remembered in the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. If there was ever a peacemaker that I met, it was John Lewis. And if you follow from there, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A little further into the book of Matthew, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. There is no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, that John Lewis was a special man. He was a special man of God, special man of God. And while his bones may rest, his legacy will live on forever in this body. And I, for one, look very forward to the day that a statue of John Lewis rests in the halls of this Congress, representing not only the great state of Georgia and the people of the state of Georgia, but all of the men and women of the United States.
Thank you, Representative Scott. We would like to recognize the gentlelady from California, Susan Davis.
Gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Susan Davis, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with John Robert Lewis's passing, we lose and deeply mourn a great friend and mentor, and the world loses the most respected good troublemaker of our time. John's standing will only grow as his legacy endures. Mr. Speaker, every year since I've been in Congress, I asked John to speak to entering high school seniors from San Diego who visited our capital as part of an in-depth civics and leadership program. And for 20 years, with each new group, of 45 very diverse students. He gave his time, his energy, and wisdom, graciously answering their many spirited questions. And they too will never forget him and how he changed them. And here's just a brief example. Alejandra Cordova from 2001 said, Mr. Lewis taught her not to be afraid to rock the boat every once in a while. And David Hickman from 2015 said, he truly showed us what it meant to be a change maker, to live through our actions and speak up against injustice. He taught our children well. John, you taught and changed me and everyone you touched. Thank you. And thank you, Michael Collins, and all of John's staff who had the hardest task of all, to say to visitors captured by John's words, I'm sorry, but the Congressman must depart now.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize fellow pastor and representative from Georgia, Representative Jody Heiss.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my good friend from North Carolina. There's no question that all of us who have served with John Lewis mourn the passing of this towering figure who devoted his life to fighting for freedom and equality. An interesting perspective of his life is the son of Alabama sharecroppers. Yet John Lewis demonstrated that in America, a single individual, even one coming from the most humble backgrounds, can have an enormous impact in this country. We all know that he rose to be a powerful leader in the civil rights movement, worked very closely with Dr. Martin Luther King and so many other great heroes who sacrificed their lives to ensure that Americans of all races live in liberty in this country. But he did so peacefully. He once wrote this, and this has a great powerful meaning. He said, release the need to hate, to harbor division and the enticement of revenge. Release all bitterness. Hold only love, only peace in your heart, knowing that the battle of good to overcome evil is already won. John Lewis knew that it was necessary to fight the sins of this country, but he understood also to fight those in a nonviolent way. And I just had the deepest respect for John Lewis and am honored to have considered him a dear friend. And I just want to thank all my colleagues this evening for joining in this time to honor such a great man and an icon, obviously, particularly in the civil rights movement. But my wife, Dee Dee, and I continue to pray for the Lewis family. And again, I just say thank you to all my colleagues for joining tonight, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Representative Donald Payne.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Congressman Donald Payne, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the gentleman from North Carolina for allowing me several minutes to pay my respects to a great man. And it's not remiss that I see the Speaker pro temp. Very appropriate that you're in the seat tonight, sir. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor John Lewis. He was an American icon, civil rights legend, and dear friend, and an inspiration to millions. Yet, these words truly fail to describe the difference he made in our country. He always spoke of getting into good trouble, and I know that's been echoed here on numerous occasions, but it sums up what Mr. Lewis was all about. His efforts led to the Civil Rights Act. His efforts led to the Voting Rights Act. And his effort led to the Congressional Black Caucus and even the election of President Barack Obama. But his loss is more than his legacy. For me, once again, I've lost one of my fathers on the floor of Congress. He was a role model for what makes a great congressman. And I constantly watched as he moved about his business. Like the way he always fought for the right thing, the way he could convey such power and strength through such a gentle demeanor. But when he had passion and was committed, there is no one else on this floor you would rather have with you going into that fight. And the way he stood up to abuse to make this country a better place. One of my greatest honors was to be a part of the sit-in he led on the House floor to fight for gun control legislation after the terrible, dreadful Florida issue. We got into some good trouble that day. He inspired us then. And his words and deeds will inspire new generations, whether they are civil rights pioneers, elected officials, or any American with a dream or cause. God bless you, Mr. Lewis. Your life made our country and our world a better place. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Walker?
Mr. Speaker, may I get a time remaining?
Gentleman has 32 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Rick Allen.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for this privilege. Mr. Speaker, many Americans learned about the civil rights movement in the news or read about it in history books. John Lewis lived it. One of my greatest memories here was to have dinner with Congressman Lewis at his home, where he shared with the entire Georgia delegation his experience in leading the civil rights movement. He shared with me that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. prayed with them on those buses before the demonstrations and urged everyone to remain at peace to ensure lasting change. I think we can all learn from the example Congressman Lewis set as a civil rights icon. We must meet injustice with humility and perseverance to do what is right. Pride and fear are the opposite of humility. John Lewis and all those in this movement demonstrated perfect love while being persecuted. Perfect love casts out all fear and only comes from God in obedience to his word, and was perfectly demonstrated at the cross of Jesus Christ. My wife, Robin, and I pray that his family finds peace during this difficult time. And this is a lesson for this body as we honor those who, like John Lewis, who have come before us and fought for an America that is stronger and is unified by putting aside our differences to serve the American people in perfect love. And I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Memphis with its own amazing civil rights history, Mr. Steve Cohen.
The gentleman from Memphis, Tennessee, Congressman Steve Cohen, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the time, Mr. Walker. And I will remember that the last time I saw John Lewis was March the 5th, his birthday, and you offered the prayer. And that meant a lot to me, and it showed me the respect that you had for him and that he had for you. It was a beautiful moment. There was not a more perfect person that's probably served in Congress, certainly that I've known in my life, than John R. Lewis. He had every quality that you would desire in a human being, and couldn't even imagine a person to have them all together. He was a hero of the civil rights movement and cared about greatly the injustices that he had seen as an African American. And that's what launched him on his civil rights struggles. But once he got moving, it was people of different issues of discrimination that he championed, whether it was gay and lesbians, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was women, whether just people being victims of gun violence. John Lewis took up the cause, and he stood up for everybody. He did not know color. He did not know gender. He did not know any differences in people. He loved all people. It was such an honor to serve with him. Early in my career, the American Bar Association presented their Day Award to John Lewis, Richard Lugar, and myself. The award was nothing compared to the fact that I was with John Lewis that day. It made me feel much greater than I ever could become. I had the great honor to travel with him to South Africa for the 50th anniversary of Robert F. Kennedy's Ripple of Hope speech in Cape Town. And I sat across from he and Bishop Desmond Tutu, and I knew I was seeing two angels together, two special souls united. Mr. Lewis loved two people in life that were his heroes. One was Dr. Martin Luther King, and another was Robert Kennedy. And that purpose of that speech, that trip, was to honor Robert Kennedy in that 50th anniversary of that speech. In that speech, Robert Kennedy said, "It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice. He sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." Robert Kennedy might as well have been speaking about John Lewis that day in 1964, because that's what John Lewis did. And he was more than a ripple of hope. He was a tsunami of hope. He was in every good cause there was, and he sacrificed himself physically in South Carolina, in Alabama, in Mississippi for civil rights, and he sacrificed himself even when he was a member of Congress for different causes, getting arrested. And when he was on death's doorstep, he got himself to Washington, D.C. to appear at Black Lives Matter Plaza and give hope and encouragement and support to the young people that were striving for the causes that he had strived for his whole life. I value every single moment I spent with Congressman Lewis. It was an honor to know him. I miss him. And just the other day, I looked up at the scoreboard, and when I didn't know quite how to vote on some issues, I would look to John Lewis and see how he voted, and he wasn't there. He was my hero. Thank you for yielding me some time, and I yield back the balance thereof.
Gentleman yields back.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. We'd like to recognize another one of Mr. Lewis's colleagues, Mr. Buddy Carter.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Buddy Carter, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, in our lives, there are people and places we remember. I will always remember John Lewis. There are some people that you feel especially honored to have met. You feel like you're one of the lucky ones who had the opportunity to hear their stories, to learn their convictions, and to feel their triumphs. I believe just about anyone who had the opportunity to meet John Lewis would agree that he is one of those people. He was born the son of sharecroppers. He grew up on his family's farm, and he attended segregated public schools in Alabama. He told his story often, and I remember him telling us the story about how he used to preach to the chickens. He went on from that humble beginning to be called one of the most courageous persons the civil rights movement ever produced, a title he rightfully deserved. John Lewis dedicated his entire life to securing equality and justice for all people while remaining a devoted advocate for nonviolence. It must have been an incredible blessing for him to see how his fight changed our nation and the entire world with his own eyes. For me, it was a blessing to know him. His office was over in the Cannon Building for many years, and my office was at the Cannon Building. And oftentimes, as we were walking over here, I'd get to walk with him. I hung on every moment, on every word, just to have the opportunity to spend time with someone like John Lewis. I'll always be grateful for those walks. Many of my colleagues in the Georgia delegation have mentioned the time that he invited us to dinner at his home here in Washington. What great stories he told that night. Truly one of the greatest experiences I have had while I've been up here in Washington, D.C. John Lewis was a giant among men. He will be deeply missed, but his legacy will live on forever. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Walker?
Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. We would like to recognize Mr. James McGovern from Massachusetts.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, sharing a jail cell with John Lewis was one of the greatest privileges of my life. When we were arrested for protesting the genocide in Darfur a few years back, we were put into a police van, booked, and fingerprinted. John had been arrested over 40 times for peaceful protest by that point. So let's just say he had some advice. John made trouble like this because he knew that words aren't enough, that real change requires action. He called it the struggle of a lifetime, but it was never his struggle alone. He challenged all of us to fight injustice and oppression and to stand up for civil rights and for human rights. Mr. Speaker, John was a great man. He's an American hero who called our country to a higher standard. But perhaps more importantly, he was a very good man. He treated every single person he met, no matter who they were, with dignity and respect. And when he saw wrong in this world, he did his best to make it right. Lisa, Patrick, Molly, and I miss you already, John. We love you, and we will never stop making good trouble in your name. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Walker?
Yes, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Michael Turner.
Mr. Turner of Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. John Lewis has a true legacy of leadership in this House, and he changed the world that we live in. When Congressman Lewis would take the podium, everyone in this House would fall silent and listen to him. I doubt in his long career in this House that the Speaker ever had to hammer the House into order to listen to John Lewis speak. A man who fought for the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis's legacy demands that Congress act. I call on Congress to pass and send to the President's desk for signature the bipartisan H.R. 1799 renewing the Voting Rights Act. Congressman Lewis was a giant in history, but he was a humble man in this House. He treated every member the same and with dignity. He will be missed. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Walker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Tony Cardenas.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate this honor to honor one of the most beautiful human beings that ever walked this earth. Many of us believe in God. Many of us try to be the best that we can be, but few of us are capable and able to live a life of true love, of tremendous dignity, and respect for every single person who comes our way. I wish I could learn how to turn my cheek the way John Lewis proved he could and did. I mourn his passing, but I celebrate the honor of knowing that he lived, and also knowing that I could go to him on the floor of this House or in the hallways of Congress and go to him and speak with him and learn from him and then say, I love you, brother. And then to have him tell me, and I selfishly relish the opportunity to hear him say, I love you too, brother, as I gave him a hug and he hugged me back. I'm unfortunate that I grew up in a very strict household where my mother and father only said, I love you to the big boys and girls and adults very few times. Once we got off their knee, it just didn't happen very often. But John Lewis reminded me how much I missed that. And in a selfish way, that's one of the reasons why I always rush to him and ask him by saying, I love you, to know that he would say, I love you. And with all his heart, mean it. I'm going to miss him. Some of my members were